efficient machinery that can sort of automate the jobs of these workers. So in cloth production, in cotton production especially, you have the power loom that starts to rear its head, and this can automate what a weaver is doing basically. And weaver is the number one job in England besides agricultural worker. So
in the entire country,
pretty much in the entire country, again, besides farmer. So there's hundreds of thousands of weavers, and this machine starts getting put into production. There's another machine for knitting that's called the wide frame, and it doubles essentially the rate that you can produce like a knitted garment that used to be a stocking frame, and eventually up to 6 times as fast. And the caveat with all these things is it's doing a much worse job, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is going to be some of the parallels that we're talking about, you know, in a little bit with generative AI and so forth. But it's stitching so the wide frame in particular, you know, you would have a skilled cloth worker who would spend hours making sure you had a nice garment that's built from the ground up, one piece, and you could be pretty certain if you were going to a skilled craftsman, you'd get a quality product that's going to last you years and years. With the wide frame or some of these forms of automation, they're making cloth 2x2 stitching together, and then they're going to fall apart faster. They're going to be a lot shoddier, but they can be sold on the market for a competitive price. All of a sudden, the weaver, or the knitters who are making their garment have to compete with that.
This is the H&M clothes of the early 19th century, right? You touch it and it falls apart.
That's right. You put it through the wash one time and oh shit, you know, it doesn't work. But they can sell more of them. You know, the entrepreneurs and the industrialists who are taking advantage of both factorization and these new machines know that they can make more stuff. Even if they have to sell it cheaper, they're still going to make more money. Now, the old mom and pop shops, the cottage industry folks, and the people who are going to become the Luddites see these trends intersecting, and they see this thing sort of starting to rise. They see industrialization taking shape, and they start protesting, you know, first, you know, in quite peaceful means. They go to Parliament and they say, look what's happening here. They're driving prices down. They're making what often amount to be like fraudulent goods, but we're going to make a real thing and try to sell it on the marketplace. Now consumers don't know if it's going to fall apart or not, so they're going to be inclined to pay less. So we cannot make a living. Let's get some guarantees on the books. Let's do a few things. Let's try to get a minimum wage. Let's uphold the regulations that have governed this trade for years and years and years, decades. Hundreds of years. But guess what? The entrepreneurs aren't falling. And you can kind of imagine the kind of arguments that they're making, which is the same arguments that technology is today. So think about Uber. When they roll into a city, and people are like, hey, and Uber's like, oh, this isn't a taxi service. This is taxis using Uber's So it's a form of carpool. It's a peer-to-peer network that you're facilitating. Even though a driver's going to show up at your door when you hire its service. So, and they would go in with their venture capital and with their sort of argument that they were a technology company and use it as an excuse to roll over all these rules and regulations that cities have. And, you know, some cities fought it, others didn't. But that playbook is 200 years old because that's what these entrepreneurs were doing. Like, oh, no. We don't need apprentices. We don't need to guarantee the quality of cloth. We don't need to pay a minimum wage. We don't need to do all these, you know, adhere to these rules. Those are for the old times. That doesn't apply. This is new technology.
Now the argument that you often also have those people make is that if you protest, you are simply denying the natural progress of technology, that the technology is inexorable, that the new world is destroying the old, and you must embrace it or you'll be left behind. And that's, in fact, what we mean when we call someone a Luddite today. Oh, you're living in the past. Yeah. You refuse to, I don't know, like, what's her name? Fran Lebowitz, who doesn't have a computer, right? Yeah. She's like, I don't want to use it, right? Yeah. That sort of stubbornness, that sticking, I don't want to join the future, is what people think of a Luddite as being. Is that what the Luddites at the time were doing?
So no. And there's, you know, think about who that argument benefits, just for a second. Like, who does that benefit? If anybody who's saying, wait a minute, like, there should be some guardrails, there should be some protections, we should be allowed to make a living when this stuff comes along, who does it benefit to sort of sideline all those arguments? The people who own the technology. It's pretty simple. Then as now, it was a very concerted effort. So a couple of things happen. After those sort of peaceful protests and the lobbying efforts fail, there's an economic crisis. England is at war with Napoleon. There are trade blockades. And at 1811, all of these things converge. And the Luddism, what became Luddism, the act that we remember, these guys taking hammers and smashing machines, was an absolute tactic of last resort. After all, like, what we might say today, like, doing it the right way failed. Like, so, unions were outlawed then. They could not unionize. There was no democracy. You couldn't, vote out a representative who wasn't paying attention. So in 1811, these cloth workers sort of organized this really sort of innovative rebellion under the banner of Ned Ludd. And Ned Ludd is this apocryphal figure who they kind of made this like Robin Hood shaped myth around, right? Like,
was there a real Ned Ludd?
There was no real Ned Ludd. He was an apprentice worker who was working too slowly for his master's benefit. So he took him to the magistrate, and the magistrate ordered that he be whipped for not working hard enough. Ned Ludd, the story goes, took up his master's own hammer, smashed his machine with it, and then fled to Sherwood Forest, where he sort of became a folk hero like Robin Hood before him. This was a story. This was their avatar. So what they would do is they would write letters to the industrialists, and they'd say, we know that you have X hundred of the obnoxious machines, they'd call them, and they've taken 600 jobs from our brothers who can no longer afford bread. If you don't take down the machines, you'll get a visit from Ned Ludd's army. And they'd pin it to the door or deliver it otherwise, and if they complied, fine. Like, they would leave them alone. If he didn't, if they kept running the machines, and a funny thing about it, they could hear a lot of the industrialists didn't want to admit they were using the machines because they knew they were hated, but they made a certain sound, a lot of the machines, so they could hear them through and they would sneak in through the window, smash the machines, or hold up the overseer by gunpoint, smash just those machines, not the machinery that had coexisted with society for decades, not their implements of the trade that they need, just the obnoxious machines. And they repeated this tactic over and over, and it was replicable, right? So there was no real Ned Ludd. So if you're 100 miles away in an industrial district and you have your own grievances, Ned Ludd can show up there and lead his army into battle. Wow. Ned Ludd can show up, 100 miles away from there and lead his army into battle. So all across the industrial districts of England, you start to see these uprisings.
This is sick as hell.
It is. So you're not the only one that thought that. They were badasses. Like, people would come out and cheer them in the streets.
Yeah.
They would clap, they would applaud, like, they were supposed to inform, to working up to the point we were talking about earlier, like the propaganda became necessary because the state would go like, there have been depredations in our district and there have been of the most unseemly kind. Please, give information on as to the participants to your local magistrate. No one would come forward. They would offer like 10 years worth of salary for some of these workers to give information that would let them, finger the Luddites, and no one came forward.
So despite the fact there were unions were outlawed, these folks were like organized. This is solidarity. This is where we're not turning anyone in. We are all Ned Ludd, and none of us are Ned Ludd.
Exactly. Yeah. There's even a historian, Eric Hobsbawm, calls it collective bargaining by law. So it was both fearsome, like, the factory owners and industrialists were legitimately afraid because they didn't know, like, they weren't in on the joke. They didn't know if Ned Ludd was fake or if there was like really a powerful organizing. This was, post-revolutionary France, so they're all worried the same thing's going to happen in England. Bring democracy, bring, all these things that might threaten their power on top of these sort of industrial disputes. So they are scared, and they are sort of, trying to figure out how to deal with it. Meanwhile, the public is cheering, and they're writing folk songs about it. It was Robin Hood of the day.
Yeah.
Until, the state gets a hold of it and sees it as this threat, right? And the state does really three things. first, it just marshals troops and sends them in by the thousands. Largest domestic occupation in English history. It's huge. There's at the height of it, I think there are like 30,000 troops just stationed, ready to fight the Luddites. And it's more than they had fighting Napoleon in one of the biggest wars that England had going on.
Wow.
So then they make it a capital offense. So if you break a machine, you can be hung, right? You can be killed for smashing a machine, for doing sabotage or vandalism. And it's actually a little side note here. Is that Lord Byron, makes his debut. He's a lord, so he's supposed to take part in politics and stuff. He makes his very first virgin speech to the to Parliament defending the Luddites. He's from Nottingham. He's from where all this stuff is happening. He's seen it in the streets, and he recognizes that the Luddites have a point. So while the state is moving to try to crush these guys, he's making this huge, thundering and famous defense of the Luddites, saying, "What are you're just gonna answer this with more barbarism? They're starving, so you're just gonna make it an outlaw. You're gonna outlaw their means of sort of addressing these grievances. You're gonna kill them." And he basically chastises the state, and it doesn't work. They pass the law anyways. So troops stationed by the thousands. It's now a crime, punishable by death to smash a machine. And then third, they have this propaganda campaign going where, they know not what they do. They're probably their minds have been warped by some deluded leader. They're dummies. They're against progress. And that they're minting this idea that has been sustained for a long time, to smash these machines, to protest any segment of technology, to challenge this in like open court, is to be a dummy, to be backwards looking, to be a Luddite.
Well, when you look at what kind of progress this was, right? Yes, a new machine has been built, but it produces work of inferior quality. That means that people who previously did the work cannot make a living, right? It's worse for everybody except for one segment of society, the people who own the machines. So, even if we were to accept the idea of technological progress as being linear advancement in a certain direction, the same way we think of, science. It's actually not even true of science, but there's a fiction that technology always goes in one direction, and that it's like always up and up and up, and tomorrow is always more advanced in some way than today, or better. There's a line graph going up and to the right. Even if that were true, in this case, it's only happening for one group of people. So there's myth upon myth upon myth here about how technology works.
That's right, absolutely. And that's again where we come to this mischaracterization of the Luddites. The biggest misconception is that they were against the technology. No, they were against that graph only being beneficial to 1% of society. If somebody had came in and said, "Hey, I've invented this way to sort of dramatically improve your productivity, and I'm going to sort of build this machine in your small shops or in your homes, or maybe we can figure out a way to do it together. We can all win from this together," it would have been such a different story. Instead, it's a proto-capitalist. Capitalism was sort of in its infancy at this stage. You can kind of see the Luddites as, fighting against the shock troops of industrial capitalism, really. But so these guys are setting up factories outside of town and setting them up in opposition to the workers' interests, in the opposition to everybody. And a lot of times they're not even trying to recruit the cloth workers to work with them. They're piping in orphans from orphanages, literally, because it's another important truism that holds to still today. When you hear automation, when you hear about AI, when you hear about the promises that we're going to automate these jobs, it's never a clean automation, as you might say. There is always an invisible sort of supply chain of usually exploited labor hiding behind it. So in that day, they're like, "Oh, these machines are more efficient. It's the future. But by the way, you got to keep shipping us children from the orphanage because that's who's really going to run the machines. We don't need it's sort of de-skilling, and that's the economist term for it. But they still need a lot of labor, and it's more precarious, more vulnerable, and that's who's making automation possible. Today, you look at these AI systems. you have precarious labor that's, doing quality assurance to make sure generative AI.
Yeah, there's people being paid pennies in Kenya to review all of the output and to make, go through the training data and take out the swears and whatnot.
Exactly.
And so, like, this is not jobs being automated, it's good jobs being replaced by bad jobs. And again, why should we accept this as progress, right? Like, my phone, my iPhone, is very advanced, and it can do more things today than it could 3 years ago. I can use it to pay for shit, and I couldn't before. I can look at it and say, how do we measure advancement? In terms of the capability of the device and its utility, to me, seems to be pretty good. But if next year Apple were to make a phone that did everything less well, they took away some features, but it's better for Apple. Apple makes more money. And by the way, we could talk about cases in which Apple has arguably done this in the past. But if they were to say, hey, the phone works less well, but it's better for us, and it's more advanced, I'd be like, well, who is it more advanced for? Why are you saying it's more? It's different.
Yeah.
It's different in a way that, from my perspective, is bad, right? Because what is technology? What is the point of technology? It is to make human work more efficient, quicker, more capable, right? To increase human ability. But in this case, for the people doing the work and the people wearing the clothes, it did not increase anyone's ability, capability, efficiency. It made everything worse, right?
That's right. And, eventually, some of the technology did improve, but these two things are disconnected. It's really a question, and remains to this day a question of who benefits.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't.
What features do you think make good selling points for games? An immersive world and interesting character development? Challenging obstacles and boss fights? Or what about how big the file size is to download?
24 megs worth of weapons, wolves, and weirdos, old killers up against Nintendo's biggest game ever.
Because for some reason, video game marketers in the 90s suddenly started doing a lot of bragging about how big the game was. And when I mean big, I don't mean the world is so expansive. No, I mean 32 megs. It seemed kind of normal at the time, but it's so totally ridiculous now to imagine. I'm guessing, looking back, this was a direct result of the console wars between Nintendo and Sega. You needed quick stats to compare one system or game to another. It's not as easy to be like, well, you see Aladdin on the SNES had a more acrobatic Prince of Persia feel to it, which goes with how Aladdin acted in the movie, while the Genesis version was more focused on action and combat. No, you needed... Genesis is 16-bit, and the NES is only 8, so it loses. What I'm showing here is by no means a comprehensive list. I just randomly flipped through some old magazines and looked up some box covers for some examples. There's gotta be so many of these out there. But I just find it so weird that I wanted to share some of these pictures. Can you imagine if someone these days was like, you should buy this game because it's a whopping 60 gigs? Like, that tells you nothing. All of these examples I was able to find were for Super Nintendo games, which surprised me a little. Maybe this was something that Nintendo was touting more than Sega during the console wars? It might also be that I'm just more familiar with SNES and knew which titles might have had something like this on them. I was genuinely surprised that the Vector Man games from Sega didn't mention the game size at all. There's plenty of good things to say about Super Mario RPG. I don't know if 32 megs was worthy of a bullet on the box. Super Empire Strikes Back says, experience the richness of a 12 megabit interactive Star Wars universe. Secret of Mana was really trying to tell everyone about that massive 16 meg cart. Not only was it on the front of the box, it's also in their full page advertisement as well. In addition to the ones I've come across so far, I'll be on the lookout for others as well and perhaps post a follow-up. Does anyone remember using these cart sizes as ammunition when talking about why one system was better than another in school? Do any of you have examples of Sega games that used the game sizes in their advertising? Is there any other ones that you can think of that I didn't mention here? Share your memories below in the comments, and as always, happy gaming.
Hello and welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again. You know, we all know that poverty is a bad thing, and I think most of us agree that the world would be a better place if poverty didn't exist, or at least were greatly reduced. It's not just the human suffering that makes poverty bad, it's also bad for an entire society if a large group of people can barely survive. That's why LBJ waged a war on poverty, and in the booming 1960s, the poverty rate indeed went down a huge 39%. But if we won a couple battles on poverty back then, we have lost the war since. You know, we had a 13% poverty rate in 1980 and an 11.5% poverty rate in 2000, but that rate was basically the same last year, 23 years later. And you know, we talk to some extent in this country about how poverty is bad. We should talk about it more. But you know what we almost never discuss? How bad extreme wealth is. The super wealthy are bad for our society. America has 800 billionaires. They're mainly men, and it is obviously bad that these people have so much money. Because just as being poor makes you less likely to be able to participate in society as a citizen, huge amounts of wealth give you a gross and unfair amount of political power. And you know what? Since we live in a democracy, I think that's a bad thing. You know, we're happy to have conversations about getting rid of poverty, but why are we so much less comfortable talking about eradicating extreme wealth? Because if extreme wealth is just as damaging to our society as poverty, why can't we imagine waging a war on that too? It's not just a foregone conclusion that we live in a society where some people are unelected god emperors with treasure palaces and apocalypse bunkers and unilateral control over our political system. It is not right or natural that unearned hereditary wealth can be passed down for centuries. Last time I checked, we had a couple revolutions to end that sort of thing, and then we were all taught in school that it's bad. So, concentration of wealth and power is simply undemocratic. And if you think democracy is the right system to decide how we run our society collectively, well, I think you'd have to say that that concentration is bad. So, what kind of arguments can we actually make against the existence of the wealthy? What limits should be placed on wealth and why? This is a radical conversation to have, but it gets less radical the more you consider it. There's a name for the philosophical view that wealth should be drastically limited. It's called limitarianism, and my guest today came up with this view and has advanced the very best arguments for it. But before we get into the argument, which I know you're going to love, I just want to remind you that if you want to support this show, you can do so on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of the show ad-free, and you can join our awesome online community full of people who love to laugh and learn and complain about billionaires just as much as you do. Patreon.com/Adam Conover. We'd love to see you there. And now, let's welcome today's guest. My guest today is the political philosopher Ingrid Robbins. She holds the chair in ethics of institutions at the Ethics Institute of Utrecht University, and her new book is called Limitarianism, The Case Against Extreme Wealth. Please welcome Ingrid Robbins. Ingrid, thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your background, the work that you do, and why you have concluded that it is a bad thing for us to have billionaires striding around the earth.
Yes, so I'm actually going to argue that it's not just bad to have billionaires, but that it's bad to have decamillionaires, people who have more than 10 million euros, pounds, dollars, in a context such as the Netherlands. But I'm sure we will get to that later. So I'm a professor of political philosophy. I'm also trained as an economist, and I have been working in my academic research for the last 20 years on questions of inequality. And often when we think about inequality, especially economists, they focus on the poor. They think we should solve poverty. But I think we've now entered a phase in the history of human societies where we should also really increasingly worry about wealth and wealth concentration. Of course, I'm not the first to say this, I'm not the last to say this, but what I've tried to do is to write a book where I focused on the moral arguments. Why shouldn't we have people that are too rich?
And so tell me what some of those arguments are. Why shouldn't we?
Yeah, so it's actually, I have a number of them. There are different types. One is that often the money is earned in a way that makes it stained. So people should not have gotten it in the first place. An important argument is that too much wealth harms societies, either because it undermines democracy or because it's incompatible with principles of ecological sustainability. And then there is the fundamental philosophical argument that I think nobody can say they deserve to be super rich and deserve in a moral sense. And there's a final argument which some people don't take too serious, which is that it's actually not good for the super rich themselves because it doesn't make them happy. Yes. Well,
I'm sorry, that's the funniest argument. To go up to Jeff Bezos and be like, yeah, dude, but you're sad. I saw you crying. You are not a happy man.
The thing is, there is actually some evidence that wealth accumulation works as an addiction. So if we are worried as human beings that our fellow human beings can be addicted to any type of drugs, and we see that also in the brain, accumulating money works in the same way, then we should probably also feel some empathy for those who are just locked up in this, not just desire, but this compulsion to just keep accumulating money. It does change the character of the super rich. That is basically the argument. And let me put it politely, not necessarily for the better.
Yeah. Yeah, it must be a compulsion to keep accumulating money because there is a point, I think we know from social science, very soon where, you earn a certain amount of money and your happiness tops out. You don't get happier if you have, $11 million versus $10 million, but there's a compulsion to keep earning more and to keep growing and growing. And, I feel it myself sometimes too, when I'm like making this podcast, I'm touring around doing stand-up comedy, and then I'm spending my nights like writing a new YouTube video because I want to, get a couple more views. And sometimes I go, wait, why am I doing this? Does it match my goals? And, I look through, I think it does right now, but it also might just be that compulsion to do more all the time. And I could see that really, if you're a banker on Wall Street or something like that, and your entire job is that number at the bottom of your spreadsheet, there would be a compulsion to have more and more all the time, and there would be nothing else behind it.
Yeah, so talking about Wall Street, there was a Wall Street trader, I can't remember the exact year, but about 10 years ago, who wrote a piece in the New York Times and then later also a book where he mentioned that he was a Wall Street trader, he had no kids, no philanthropic goal to work for, no debts, and still he was angry because his annual bonus had only been like 3 million, and why wasn't it more? And then he realized this was really like an addiction he had earlier, had some alcohol addiction, I think. And so that's really the idea of the addiction. Is it's not an idea. There is really some evidence in how it works. And there's also an interesting little book written called The Psychology of Money by somebody who advises, who's a financial advisor, who also says the only way to really not start to do kind of crazy things or criminal things or to let it take over your life is by just saying, okay, until here and not further. This is my goal, and then that's all I need, that's all I want, and it liberates people to not want to have more. It gives peace of mind. But anyway, I actually think this argument for the super rich themselves, I mentioned it as the last one because I think the really important ones are that it harms us and that it's undeserved. These are the fundamental ones.
Well, let's get to those first. That was a very good piece of practical advice for Jeff Bezos if he's listening to the show. Set a limit and then just stop, Jeff, and get some sleep. But
he can look at what his ex-wife did.
I know.
Because she's giving it all away, and she's giving it away in a very interesting manner because she's not like deciding what the money must go to, but she's giving it to organizations who then themselves take control and can decide what to do with it.
Yeah, and we've talked about that in a past episode of the show on billionaire philanthropy and the problems with it, and she's perhaps there's still problems with philanthropy at that level, but, she is sort of the least bad of someone who's giving money away for that reason, if you want to commend that at all. Let's talk, though, about this very enticing argument you make that no one deserves that amount of money. You say no one can really argue that they deserve that amount of money. I have to say, I live in the United States. I hear people make that argument every day, Yes. Every time I make a video about Elon Musk, people say, oh, well, why don't you have all that money? It's because you suck. That's the only reason you don't have it. If you were as good and smart and wonderful a person as Elon, you would have earned the money because he deserved it and you didn't. So what is your counter argument to that?
Yeah, so, what you're just describing is really the way this, I think the word we should really use is ideology, this meritocrat neoliberal ideology that that puts always the focus on the individual and thinks that the individual deserves something, and if they are economically successful, it's because of their own, something to do with themselves. If they're miserable, they can be blamed. That kind of framework, that kind of ideology, which we have increasingly come to think, is not the only way to look at human beings. And actually, once upon a time, we looked differently at human beings. This way of thinking has also not fallen from the sky. It has come from a deliberate movement of first thinkers and then politicians who've increasingly made us think like this. So this is just by way of background. So what do I think is based on what I've been reading in various types of scientific fields? What do I think is the real way we should look at human beings? I think we should put luck central. And luck comes in different forms. The first form is what you could call biological luck or the natural lottery. The genes you have are not of your own choice. So you can't say, I chose my genes. The credits for my good genes are mine because you didn't choose your genes. Your talents, your creativity, also the stamina. Are you able to work really hard? Are you able to do long days? Differs quite radically between people. There is only so much of this that can be really trained and learned. It is also just kind of difference between people. And if you happen to have what we philosophers call drawn a good ticket from the natural lottery, you should count your blessings rather than saying, look what a fantastic human person I am. So that is the first type of luck. And the problem, and why I focus on luck, is because luck can never be the basis for desert. That is the fundamental equation in this argument, that if you want to say that you deserve something, you must always trace your achievement back to something for which you can take credit. And you can't, by definition, take credit for luck. So the first type of luck is natural luck. The second type is social luck. The parents you were born with, the social class, the city, the country. If you're born in the US, your opportunities are vastly bigger than if you're born in say, Afghanistan.
Yes.
So, and we don't choose where we are born. We don't choose our parents, which also means we don't choose our inheritance, if any, because that's also a type of luck. And then the last type of luck is what economists call market luck. So, if you have two entrepreneurs who are equally willing to really go the extra mile, put in all the hours, take the risks, then it can still be the case that one of them, because of the way markets work, and they often allocate the big prizes to one winner, it's winner takes all markets, that their luck also plays a role. And while luck may only play a small role in deciding who takes the big prize and who basically disappears or takes a smaller role, say as an artist, luck sometimes is really the pivotal thing. So there is an interesting book written by an economist called Robert Frank, an American economist. It's called Success and Luck. I think that's the title. And he explains, based on studies, that, for example, if companies have to decide which CEO they need to hire, all these CEOs are extremely talented. They're very skilled. They are experienced. What then makes the difference? It's this tiny little bit of luck. So even though luck may not play in absolute numbers a very big role in deciding who becomes very wealthy and who doesn't, it is the factor that makes a difference. So if we then embrace this view that luck plays such a big role in our lives, then I think the right attitude, if we're economically successful, if we become rich, is really to be generous towards those that were less lucky. And that, I totally agree, is really fundamentally at odds with the prevailing view in society.
With entrepreneurs, so much of the time it matters to be in the right place at the right time. That, if you were selling masks or video conference software in early 2020, something very lucky happened to you that March, right? That caused your business to skyrocket. It wasn't because of your great intelligence. You didn't know what was going to happen, et cetera. Or if you were, I don't know, making steel at the right time during World War II or whatever it was, that these things happen that we can't, take personal responsibility for. I mean, one of the first philosophical questions I can remember asking myself as a child was, why am I here in the United States? Why is my consciousness here in the United States, right? In this body as opposed to any other, right? And it's still something that I find fundamentally mysterious, the fact that there's many humans and I am but one of them, and I happen to be this one, and why am I not a different one? And it's a cosmic dice roll. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and once you start to really realize like the enormous luck we have to be born in a country where, I mean, I feel still every day blessed that I'm also in a country. So I prefer countries that have decent social security systems. I mean, decent welfare states also for the compatriots that are less lucky, people who are disabled, who become unemployed or whatever. I still feel lucky that I happen to be here. I could also have been somewhere else. Yeah. And I think once you realize this, I mean, so it's really, it's both like, how do we treat each other? How do we allocate kind of, not just financial rewards, but also, I guess, empathy to other people, because it's not just, this works not just towards those that are extremely successful. I think we should still congratulate people. So you can congratulate me with my book. I will take the congratulations. I can congratulate you with your show. All of that is fine, because in the end we do put in an effort, and it would be kind of strange to treat each other as determinist robots. That's not what I'm arguing for. But I still a bit of kind of modesty in would really, I think, change the way we are generous or not, but also the way we organize society.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the other reasons for that humility in a little bit, but I want to get to first what I think is your main argument, which is that billionaires and people who are over decamillionaires are bad for the rest of society, that this sort of concentration is a bad thing in and of itself, even if one were to think one deserves it.
Yeah.
Even if a very deserving billionaire were to exist, and we were all to say, yes, very good job, we have no problems with how you did it, and with you having this money, that would still be bad. And tell me why you think that is.
Yeah. So I think the case of how wealth concentration undermines democracy, so the principle of political equality, is the clearest, and especially in the US. I mean, American political scientists have written papers and books where they argue that the US is actually no longer a democracy, but an oligarchy or plutocracy, because of the way money influences politics. And money can influence politics in different ways. The most obvious is donations to political parties or to candidates. And and that is, I think, a significant difference between the US and Europe, because we have quite strict rulings on how much you can donate to a political candidate. Actually, in my country, in the Netherlands, the last government made that rule even more stricter. They decided that each person can give a maximum of 100,000 euros per person per year to politics. Of course, those who want to really have a bigger influence on politics will still try to find a way around, but it's difficult. And also, all the donations to political parties are in an open register, so everybody can see what happens.
Wow.
In the US, as you know much better than I do, money can really buy politics quite significantly, and it's also quite difficult to stand for political office if you don't have what they call a war chest.
Yeah.
So that is unfortunately the reality. So that's one. And then what political scientists have shown is that the policies that follow are really skewed towards the interests of the rich.
Yeah.
And that is the first problem. The second problem is, or the second mechanism in which this happens is...
Let me just dwell on the first problem a little bit, if that's okay. I think we sort of don't talk enough about what we mean by democracy and political equality, which is that it's the ability of average people to have a say in how the country is run, and for there to be some level of equality there. And if a small number of people have a vast amount more power than everybody else, that's a major step back towards monarchy or towards aristocracy, where a small number of people are literally running the society that we live in. And it's one of those things where I was like, I was just brought up being told that's what, the American Revolution was about.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's not American values, is for a small number of people to lord over the rest of us. But that's what inevitably happens when there's too much concentrated wealth.
Yes, and I really think it is. The book that I wrote, when I talk about it in continental Europe, I often get the reaction, but this is really an American problem, what you're describing. And it's not true. I mean, I have also lots of scientific studies that show, and also arguments that show that some of the problems are also really, they're universal problems and they play in Europe too. But the problem about how money translates, so basically financial power translates in political power, is everywhere, but it's especially, I think, a problem in the US because the walls that you have to build between the sphere of money and the sphere of politics in the US they're very weak.
Yeah.
Also because, I mean, if you say that companies that give money is a form of speech, then of course, I mean, what is this kind of reasoning? And that is I guess a very specific problem for the US. It's funny that you mentioned monarchies because I've lived all my life in monarchies, first in Belgium and then in the Netherlands. But our monarchs have like almost no power.
Yeah.
In Belgium, they say that actually the monarch keeps the country together. So that's the main role they play.
They're kept in such a little box, I mean, I knew some people who were a little mad about all the gossip about, the British royal family. And I'm like, that is all they're for at this point. They're just there for everyone else to gossip about. This is the only purpose. They have no other role, so.
Yeah, they play a different role. They have, in any case, very little political power. I think the question you asked about what is democracy really is a fundamental one. So it is not just having the right to vote, it's also being able to vote. So, for example, not having you being hindered from voting. It's also, I mean, all the other factors that can prevent people from voting, but also political participation. In the end, the ideal democracy, which is an ideal, so we will never be able to fully reach that, is that we govern ourselves together. That means that everybody who wants to and has an interest has an equal potential influence on society, and we are very far from this. And the influence of the disproportionate influence of the very rich on politics is not just directly via politics, but also, for example, because of the way they influence the public sphere.
Yes.
So if you have somebody like Rupert Murdoch, who just kind of buys up, first in Australia, then in the UK, and now in the US, who buys up media power and really becomes a very important factor that shapes the public discourse, then you create, from money, you create power that is a form of political power. Politics is not just about voting. I mean, this is an open door, we all know this, but we have to then really think like, what are the preconditions for a robust democracy? And I think that having, for example, also public institutions that are outside the sphere of money, like have education outside, so have basically high quality public education, high quality public universities, high quality public media. These are all, I think, very important to get a kind of political ecosystem that protects democracy. And the problem is that money undermines this.
There's a broader vision of democracy that I'm always trying to promote on this show, which is, because the one that we're brought up with is so limited to you vote, you donate, maybe you protest and hold a sign, that's it. And that's all democracy is. But no, democracy is having participation in all of how your society is run and making sure that it reflects the will of all of the people. And that includes things like media or, the conditions under which you work or the town that you live in. So if a billionaire is so powerful that they can buy an entire communications media and start bending it to their will, like Elon Musk did with Twitter, or if a billionaire is so powerful that they can buy your entire town and control the the buildings that you live in, like I forget the name of the guy, but the Warren Buffett's partner, who's a billionaire, designed his own dorm room for like 1,000 students in, I believe, UC Berkeley. That's like a horrible jail. But he was able to do it because he had so much money he could donate it and say, build a building like this because it's my idea. And they're doing it, and it's going to be horrible. Everyone who lives there is going to be miserable. But the only reason it happened is because this man had so much power. That kind of power over the world the rest of us live in is undemocratic, even when it doesn't touch our political system properly conceived, narrowly conceived. We don't want to live in a society where one or two people are able to control the rest of us like that. That's not the fucking point of this.
Yeah, and there's actually two things that make it even worse. One is that once, so often the super rich, the multimillionaires, they also kind of they used politics, then basically politicians, for their own purposes. So so Abigail Disney made a film about the company of her grandfather, and she talks about the Disney park in California,
in Anaheim.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I was trying to find a word. Thanks for helping
I'm an
me.
expert in Southern California geography. If I have any questions for you about Utrecht, you'll let me know.
Yes, that's a deal. So, so she and the movie is actually so it's a documentary, and it's very revealing because it really shows how they also, because they become so important and so influential, the local government also just starts to do stuff for the company that makes it even richer.
Yes.
And this mechanism where really you see I described in the book a couple of really, really bad cases like the kleptocrats, which we have Putin is a good example, Berlusconi in Italy was a good example. We had, but you have them everywhere. And so it becomes really bad at all levels. So that's an additional problem. But another problem is that the super rich, the billionaires, also no longer become so rich that they kind of almost no longer need democracy. So we, ordinary folks, we need each other. We need each other to survive, to have good lives. But if you look at what people like Peter Thiel does, so I don't know how much this has been discussed in the US, but I'm sure I don't know all the details myself, but he took on additional citizenship in New Zealand, which is very, very difficult to get. The reason he could get it was because of some contributions to the economy of New Zealand, and then he needed that because he wanted to buy some unspoiled land, and that land, which is close to a lake that is actually sacred for the local indigenous people, the Maori, he can go there and live there with his friends when the apocalypse hits the US. And then you also, of course, have the super rich with their bunkers. So they have all these strategies. I mean, Musk going to space is another example. Rather than trying to fix the problems that we have collectively on this planet,
yes,
they have these escape fantasies. But some of them, it's not just fantasies. I mean, if you have a private jet or you have multiple private jets and you just have bought a really nice piece of land in New Zealand and you just say, okay, when shit hits the fan, I just take my friends and we fly there. Yeah.
Well, this is a fantasy that so many people have. I think it's not just a fantasy of the wealthy. The average people have the fantasy of, I want a little compound out in the middle of nowhere. I want to just, have some goats and, not need anyone and have a safe place for me and my polycule or whatever it is people want to, get together. But I think for average people, well, we can't really do it because we're so dependent on others ultimately at the end of the day. Billionaires are able to live in the fantasy world where their dependency on others is so abstracted away from them, is so small. They don't see the Amazon factory workers making minimum wage 12-hour days peeing in bottles that they are actually dependent on for their wealth. Yep. They have the ideology, they did it themselves, and that they can go sequester themselves separately away from everyone. I'd like to get into the economic argument. What is bad about having a small number of people with incredible concentrations of wealth for the economy and for, everyone else's earnings?
Yes. So I actually don't, in my book, I don't spend a lot of time talking about the economic argument because as a philosopher, for me, the economy is a means to an ends. And the ends is the things that are valuable. It is our well-being, our flourishing, our freedoms, our possibility to shape the life how we want it to have. So the economy is a means to that. Still, I understand that you want to have a flourishing economy because it really helps us to have these good lives. And so many people are actually primarily moved by the economic arguments for limiting inequality. And the argument is that increasingly the rhetorics that we've been told since the 80s, namely that if you allow the rich to become as rich as they can, and inequality is like a price to pay for them becoming so rich, everybody will benefit. So that's trickle-down theory. Trickle-down theory is just a piece of theory. It's actually it's proven not to be true.
Has that ever happened? I don't think so.
No. So the Australian economist John Quiggin has a really nice term for this. He has written a book called Zombie Economics. And so basically he says there's a couple of ideas, actually they're dead, but once in a while they keep coming back. And of course with trickle-down economics, we've seen in the UK that Liz Truss, who was the prime minister for 80 days, that she really believed in trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics is kind of a pretext to be able to let the rich pay fewer taxes, because we see that this doesn't work. If you want to grow the economy, you need to invest in the human capital of everybody. That means make sure people are healthy, that the communities are safe, and that they have good education and decent housing. And then you really release the potential of people. And then, of course, you need not too much bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. And that means that if you reduce inequality, it actually has a positive effect on economic growth. And the opposite, so the idea that inequality is kind of the price to pay for overall more economic growth, was the view that neoliberal economists have been pushing in the 70s and the 80s. And that was standardly believed to be true until, I don't know the exact year, but at some point, some years ago, even the IMF, which is seen as the headquarters of this kind of neoliberal thinking, at some point said, no, inequality can really become too big, and then it just, independent of all the other factors, it hurts the economy. So there's no longer a business case for inequality. There is, however, a case for those that are super rich, because they can still become more richer and richer and richer.
Right. They can say, oh, it's working great for me. We can say, hey, we've been trying your strategy of inequality fueling the economy for the past 50 years at least. Doesn't seem like it's going that great, right? Nobody thinks the world economy is in very healthy shape right now, nor has it been since the 90s, I would say, that people were like, oh, things are going great. And inequality has skyrocketed. It seems like these two things have gone together, and that might be time to try something new in terms of macroeconomics.
So I really think the problem is that we, and then when I say we, I mean ordinary folks, we like not to talk about economics. We think economics is complicated. We think it's boring. So we leave all of that to other people. And then, of course, when politicians tell us something about the economy, we have no idea so we basically believe them because they have beautiful eyes, or because we think they're a guy with whom we can go and have a beer at a barbecue. So
we listen to the economists because they have beautiful eyes. I love that. No,
I don't know what the reason is, but I think we should really empower ourselves in terms of economic literacy, so that we are able to really question what politicians are telling us when they propose economic policies.
Well, I've heard this argument, and I actually would really like to get someone on the show to dive into it. The argument that, economics has been treated as perhaps too hard of a science for the past few decades, and that, politicians will tend to listen to economists. The economist says blah, 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 and say, oh, well, the economist said it, we must do it, without realizing that, economics is a very interpretive field, that there's a lot of ideology in it, and that, we've been listening to a field that's been dominated by a certain ideology of economics for a very long time without really questioning it, which is not the case in sciences such as physics, climatology, etc. These are sciences that, you know, have a lot more objective reality to it. But economics is a social science, and it's as though we were all listening to Freudian psychoanalysts as though they were, you know, telling us the truth. Well, there's a lot of truth in it, but we know that that's one school among many, and that's sort of the same thing that's happened with economics.
No, that's absolutely true. Yeah, so basically, you hit the nail. Yeah, that's just true. Yeah, so I think, but I should also say, I think the politicians, when they talk about economics, they really cherry pick what they like, and they also cherry pick, of course, the economists they will put as their advisors.
Yes.
Because economists, although I have a lot of criticism on economics as an academic discipline, I also think, for example, economists have been arguing for pricing the damage we do to the environment for as long as I can remember. I remember when I was an economics student, and that's like more than 30 years ago, that we had a professor already having a whole team of researchers talking about what economists then call internalizing the negative externalities into the price. So basically, how can you make sure that if somebody sells a product, that the harm to the environment is actually factored into the price so that they will sell less and that there will be some compensation. And there you just see that we are still ruining the environment.
Yeah.
So I think it's a mixed thing about how much we should blame economists as a profession. But I do think it's definitely the case that they have become very, they've weeded out all the heterodox, what we tend to call heterodox schools. And they've also, and then I'm talking really as somebody who first studied economics and then studied philosophy, they have tried to pretend to be like physics. Mm-hmm. Some economic methodologies call this the physics envy among economists. And they... There's papers written about this. But economics, because it's about society, ultimately is also about what we owe to each other. And that is the core of ethics and political philosophy.
Yes.
So you can't separate economics from normative questions. What is good, what is desirable, what is better?
Yes.
And that for me is really, where I like to make a contribution.
And economics is built on, it's a human thing, right? Money is something that humans invented, right? I love, you know, the writer Yuval Noah Harari, who I don't always agree with, but has a wonderful argument about, you know, poverty is imaginary. We made it up. It's not a feature of the natural universe. You know, it's a human thing that we created, that some people have a lot of money and some people don't. And people tomorrow could decide to do something different, and different rules would apply. And that's a fundamental way that economics is different from physics, because the same is not true.
So, but this is, here you're talking about poverty. I mean, this is really a very, very interesting example of how economics is, not just economics, but also economic policy judgments are ideological. Because one of the arguments that have been made in favor of capitalism in the form that we have it is, look at what capitalism did with the global poor. The number of people living in absolute poverty has really plummeted. And it's true. And then people looking at those data will say, yeah, capitalism, no other system has ever done this, so capitalism is the best system we have for the poor. And that's where their argument ends. And then basically we have to start to ask questions, what is that poverty line? It turns out that poverty line is $2.2 purchasing power parity per day. That means what you can buy with $2.2 in the US per day. It's not what you can buy with $2.2 in Antananarivo or Kabul or wherever.
Wow.
So that means that line is way too low. So you should have like, say, $11, and then you still see that there are still many, many people in poverty. But I think the much more fundamental question that economists and politicians should ask themselves is, all right, it's true, the number of people that live in absolute poverty has become much, much smaller. But what had been alternative scenarios that would also have been economically feasible? And are there scenarios in which that number would have come down much more? And I think the answer is yes. Because if you look at what we created, all of us together with the global economy over the last couple of decades, and if you look at the absolute shares that went to the global north and then mainly to shareholders in the global north and what went to the garment workers in the global south, we've given them breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
We have taken really the vast share for ourselves. And that means that everything in the end is also a question about how do you distribute what you produce together. So, and that means that it's true that poverty is in that sense, well, imaginary. I don't know whether I would use that word, but it is to some extent what we choose, because we could have chosen for a different division of the economic gains in which we would have much fewer people in poverty.
So people say, hey, look at this. A whole lot of people used to make $1 a day. Now they make $2 a day. Capitalism is a big success. They don't point out that a bunch of other people who used to, I don't know, make $1 million now make $10 million. And that's where most of the gains went. And well, hey, those people who make $2 now, they could have had 5 or 10 or 20 under a different system. You're ignoring the fact that we still have kept most of it for ourselves.
Shout out to Claritin for supporting this episode and for providing us with samples. You know, my ability to conduct interviews on this show pretty much depends on me being able to have smooth conversations with guests. But let me tell you, if you're plagued by seasonal allergies, as I often am, you know the struggle of trying to maintain your cool while you're gunning for the world record in consecutive sneezes and your nose is running like your life depends on it. Luckily for those of us who live with the symptoms of allergies, we can live Claritin Clear with Claritin D. This double-action combination of prescription-strength allergy medicine and the best decongestant available will lower my shopping experience.
Put a cap on the amount that people can, is it earn, or is it the amount of wealth that they can have? What is it?
It's wealth, so it's what we have. But let me just give you a bit of context. So I say that we should strive to have a world, so it's an ideal. It's not something we're going to implement like tomorrow. I say that we should strive to have a world in which nobody is super rich. And I propose two caps. And one is the higher is what you could call the political or the institutional. And we should reorganize society and the economy in such a way that we keep inequality within bounds. Now, then obviously the question is, where do you put that cap? And the exact answer should be something like, it should be at a level where the damages to the political system and to the environment of the super wealthy are minimized, but there's still enough room to let people who are motivated by financial gain do their thing.
Right.
So those who really only will work because they want to become rich, they should have enough space. And then that's basically the trade-off that you try to make.
We gotta let those sickos cook, you know, like they're so motivated by money. There's people who are born like that every day. We gotta give them something to do or they're gonna go nuts.
Yes, but the question is, so some people say to me, oh, but actually there was a book review in The Economist that says, no, this is crazy, because if people do not know that they could become super, super, super rich, they will no longer become entrepreneurs. And then my answer is, how? Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah.
There's no evidence. So I think if people could become very well off, they could become really rich, but not extremely rich, I think they would still try to be successful entrepreneurs. So I think this is again a kind of almost an exchange of rhetorics. But what we should then do is to organize society in such a way that, of course, the taxation will be much more progressive, that there will be taxation on capital gains and on income from income from entrepreneurship at the same level as on income from labor, which we don't have now, because now we tax labor much more than we tax capital.
Yeah.
And I guess and then if you ask what would be the number, I think it would also depend on how society looks like. So the more you have in a society public goods, a decent healthcare system, public education, and so forth, things outside of the sphere of the market and profit-making capitalism, the more you have those things, the lower that level can be. So I suggest, but this is really like a ballpark figure and as a start for the debate on this, that in a country such as the one as where I live, the Netherlands, where we do have a public pension system all of us are entitled to public pension, which is roughly around the poverty line. And then we try to save for having additional pension. And we have high quality public education, and we have a healthcare system for all, which is, it's like not like the British system, which is completely public. It's a regulated, more mixed system. I say for a society like this, 10 million. I know in the US people would say 10 million. 10 million.
That's not enough.
Nothing.
I can't even send my kid to private school and like fuel my private jet for 10 million.
Exactly. You know, we don't need private school. So that is the thing, of course, that you could say, well, I mean, I don't mind if people say, well, you know, in the US, perhaps in current circumstances, make it, I don't know, 20 or 50, or even if you want 100 million, but definitely not a billion. You don't need a billion. Nobody needs a billion. So I think the idea that you hear in American politics that we shouldn't have any billionaires is just not ambitious enough. So that is the political limit.
Wow.
And then there is a second limit, which is really just the answer to the question, how much do I as an individual need?
Yeah.
And there I did some research together with colleagues from economic sociology. And we asked a representative survey, a sample of Dutch people, where they say, so we gave them descriptions of the material quality of life of imaginary families. And we asked to give them a label. Is this person poor, reasonably well off, very well off, rich? So rich, the phrasing was, nobody needs so much money, this is too much. And then we increasingly made the descriptions more affluent, and we were able then to make an estimate of where the Dutch would draw that line. And for a family of 2 parents, 2 children, data for 2018, so that's pre-inflation, we found that they said that around 2.2 million euros, people say, okay, now it's enough for this family. Yeah. So I therefore say in the book, I think if you have as an individual, if you have 1 million in a country such as the Netherlands, I have to repeat this, you have enough. And I should say, I often give lectures to citizens where I'm in a debate, and then I'm sometimes challenged that somebody says, but why 1 million? Why not much? Isn't that too low? And then I just ask people in the room, okay, who here in this room has less than 1 million and still feels they have everything they need? And then all those hands go up.
Yeah.
I just think we don't need, I mean, also you should know, if you just look at the data, the vast majority of people do not have so much money.
Yeah.
So it is just this fixation with always having more that has become this almost like ideological thing that has spread throughout the world.
Oh my God.
And I think we should get that back into the bottle.
The argument that you're making, I'm imagining you arguing with a billionaire, right? Who says, well, hold on a second, you can't do this. I need this money. And then you're like, okay, who here's happy with their, much less than $1 billion and thinks they have everything that they need in the world? And 99% of the hands go up. And then you go back to this billionaire. Okay, why do you need the money?
Yeah.
Like, what do you need it for? Like, what is it for? Other than, building monuments to yourself, donating to your favorite causes. Okay, that's fine, but everyone has a favorite cause. Why should you get to choose your favorite cause versus anybody else?
It's a status and a power thing. It's really status and power. And that is really where I think, okay, status and power, there are different ways in which we can try to acquire status and power. But the problem with money is that if money becomes a thing by which you try to acquire status and power, it harms the rest of us.
Yeah.
Because of the reasons we discussed, and also because it deprives money to the government who needs that money to alleviate poverty, to build roads and all that other stuff.
You can
so
also
that is
have,
why,
you can also have status and power with $10 million. You don't need $1 billion to do it.
I agree. I agree.
Like, I'm lucky enough that I've been able to donate to a local politician who I care about well enough that I get to go to a little event and shake their hand, and they say thank you. That makes me feel good, and also it's someone I believe in, and it's within it's a legal limit, right? It's like $800 here in LA. And you know what? that's plenty. You know what I mean? Get to feel a little bit special, get to help out. I could donate more than that to a local nonprofit, and then, you know, maybe they put my name in the newsletter or whatever it is. That's a healthy version of this dynamic that people want. It's when you inflate it to the 100 million or the billion level that it becomes toxic, that no one needs quite that much status.
Exactly. So the funny thing is that with donations and philanthropy, so I have a chapter in the book that's called, now I forgot the title. It's something like, oh yes, it is, Philanthropy is Not the Solution. That's the title of that chapter. Yes. And the problem, and so basically there's something paradoxical almost that I do in that chapter, because on the one hand, I argue that I think all of us should really consider whether we may have too much. Because we have, for example, say upper middle class people who just were lucky because their houses, they bought a house in, say, the 90s for just very little money, and then there was a boom in housing prices, and now they're old and they're sitting on this house that is worth more than $1 million. Well, I think, should they give $1 million to their kids? I'm not sure. Or there can be other reasons. So I think the question, can I give more, is a question that I think many more people can ask themselves than only those that have more than $1 million or 10 million.
Yeah.
So that is where I think actually giving is a good thing. But the problem is when the giving comes with power, then it's problematic. So I think small money donations, small money philanthropy, what everybody can do is very good because it doesn't have any power. But as soon as the donations really entail a form of power or are really wasteful, and actually sometimes philanthropy, I mean, you have a whole episode on this, but philanthropy is also a way to really engage in tax avoidance and tax evasion. So there's also really dirty forms of philanthropy. That's what we should try to
power
avoid.
hoarding. People build power for themselves via philanthropy, through family foundations. You can't donate the money to your kids without paying a lot of taxes. Instead, you create a foundation and give that to your kids. And now your kids wield political power because they're distributing billions of dollars or millions of dollars for the rest of their lives. The Patagonia founder did this to much great acclaim, and I made a video that was very critical of him for essentially hoarding that kind of political power for his family. This is such a radical proposal. I'm curious, and I love that you say the American call that only the far left has in the United States to ban billionaires, right? You'll hear Bernie Sanders, who's on the left of our acceptable, political Overton window in American politics, will say there should be no such thing as billionaires. A couple other people as well. That's already a fringe position. You say that doesn't even go far enough, and that we need to ban 100 millionaires, centimillionaires.
Yes.
So what would society look like were we to do so? Can you paint us a little bit of a picture of, it's almost like an Ursula K. Le Guin novel. Like what is this? What is this fantastical world that you're describing? But I'd love to hear a little bit about it.
Yeah. So I really think that should be the next book, right? And it's also the last chapter. I say, okay, what does this now demand? It demands a different way of organizing the society. I don't know exactly how this would look like, but what I think we should do is...
For the last 10 years, game making being only a few years between the launch of Dungeons & Dragons and home computers, it's not surprising that a lot of early PC games were basically computerized D&D, with the machine taking on the role of a digital dungeon master. But one game stood out more than the rest: Rogue. Designers Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman wanted to make an RPG that would feel completely different each time you play, so hit upon the idea of using procedural generation. Now, the dungeon layouts are randomly cobbled together by a computer, which is following certain rules for how to place down rooms, corridors, loot, and enemies. They also didn't want a way for players to simply learn the dungeon through rote repetition, and so hit upon another idea that would come to define a genre. When you die, you die. No checkpoints, save states, or respawns. It's back to the very beginning and onto an entirely new dungeon. Now, I'll admit, I didn't play Rogue as a kid, but it's been so influential on the games I play today that I just had to include it. We'll have to wait until much later in the list to see these ideas truly come into their own. you can play Rogue in your browser or on Steam. It took a surprisingly long time for game developers to think of letting a character jump. It took even longer to make that jump feel fun. Consider Mario's first game, Donkey Kong, in which Mario has 3 predictably pre-programmed jumps, up, left, and right. But by Super Mario Bros., Mario has, well, essentially an infinite number of jumps. That's because the height is determined by how long you hold the button, because the distance is driven by how fast Mario is running before you leave the ground, and because you can even influence the plumber's mid-air movement. By having a jump that is driven by the push and pull of physics, gravity, and player input, the simple act of leaping around is made incredibly fun, expressive, and challenging, a mechanic that could sustain an entire game, or indeed, an entire genre of games. Mario's platforming has certainly improved in later games. The physics were tweaked and perfected in Super Mario Bros. 3, they were perfectly reimagined in 3D in Super Mario 64, and new moves like the spin, ground pound, wall jump, long jump, and hat throw had even more expressive action. But Super Mario Bros. Is still worthy of study for its ambitious first stab at a proper video game jump. Super Mario Bros. Is available as part of the NES library on the Switch Online service. While Shigeru Miyamoto and co. were finishing up Super Mario Bros., they were simultaneously working on another game that would, kick off a 40-year franchise and change the course of video game history. What's your side hustle, huh? That game was, of course, The Legend of Zelda, an adventurous fantasy epic designed to emulate Miyamoto's childhood memories of exploring the Japanese countryside. And it did this by giving the player a huge amount of freedom. You're dropped into a forest clearing and told to, essentially, get on with it. Your goal is to find 8 pieces of a giant golden triangle, but how you do this is largely up to you. You can now go in any direction, explore where you like, and take on challenges in any order you see fit. Sure, there are some obstacles that can't be overcome until you find certain power-ups. Many areas are filled with tough baddies who will flatten an inexperienced adventurer, and the 8 underground dungeons are technically numbered. But still, Zelda 1 gives a remarkable amount of freedom to players, and this makes your journey through the game feel personal and special. It's driven by curiosity rather than a designer's leading hand. You can get it on the Switch Online service. After the success of Super Mario Bros., platformers fell into a predictable formula. A series of levels, split into a series of worlds, played in whatever order the designer intended. But Capcom shook that idea up with Mega Man. This game begins on a stage select screen with 6 buttons that take you to the lairs of 6 different robot masters, and you can take these dudes on in any order you like. This gives the player a greater sense of freedom and encourages replayability, as the game will feel subtly different each time you play. But it's more than just picking the order. Every time you defeat a robot master, you'll take on one of their powers, and those powers will prove helpful in other levels and against other bosses. For instance, you can defeat Gutsman to unlock a rock-chucking super arm, which will destroy Cutman in a couple hits. Rock beats scissors, after all. Now, I don't think the idea is perfect. It didn't take long for magazines to start sharing the optimum route through the game, but it was a start, and is absolutely still the go-to cultural touchstone for a game where you can pick your own order to undergo challenges. Mega Man can be played as part of the Mega Man Legacy Collection, which contains all 6 original NES games. Tetris is the perfect game. I don't mean it's the best game ever made or anything, but I mean it feels like a complete, pure specimen, like a natural property of the universe that was discovered rather than designed, like a Rubik's Cube or a chessboard or Ryan Gosling. But the aspect I want to focus on is the interesting way it handles difficulty, because as the game goes on, with you manically trying to drop blocks into perfect lines, the game ramps up the challenge in 2 different ways. The first way is that the speed increases after you clear a certain number of lines. This is a sort of artificial difficulty, the designer essentially reaching in and tweaking the numbers to make your life harder. But the second way is what you might call diegetic difficulty. Basically, the more blocks there are on screen, the less time it takes for new blocks to fall, and the harder it is to play. The game becomes more difficult as a natural outcome of the play space. It arises from the rules of the game's universe, hence diegetic. You can see a similar thing in a game like Snake, where the longer your body grows, the harder it is to avoid crashing into it. It's an elegant way to make a game more difficult in a way that is clearly visible and immediately understandable. You can play Tetris in your browser, but you might as well play the beautiful modern reimagining Tetris Effect. There's so much you could say about the influence and importance of Doom. It was a pioneer in 3D graphics, online deathmatch, shareware, cheat codes, community-driven mapmaking, and it was so formative for the first-person shooter genre that similar games were all called Doom clones for about half a decade. But this isn't supposed to be a history lesson, and luckily, Doom is more than a stuffy old historical artifact. In fact, it's still wildly fun to play in 2024, and that's because, among other reasons, the game is fast. Doom Guy whips around the environment like the dudes on rocket-powered roller skates. Where many modern shooters feature flat-footed characters who run out of stamina while jogging towards cover points, Doom's protagonist is lightning quick, which makes encounters feel frenetic and fast-paced. And that plays perfectly with the enemies, who all play with space and position, like the biting Pinky. You'll want to keep a lot of space between you and them, or the imp's meandering fireball projectiles, which can be dodged with fancy footwork. There's so much to learn from Doom, but at the end of the day, it's just a really fun game. It's available on Steam and the major consoles. With the Metroid franchise, which really found its footing in 1994's Super Metroid, Nintendo stumbled upon a powerfully potent gameplay loop, one that centers on the joy of exploration. The game takes place on the planet Zebes, which is not split up into distinct levels or worlds. Instead, it's a single contiguous play space, a non-linear, interconnected ant farm of corridors and elevators. Then again, your travel is often impeded by obstacles like doors that require special missiles or superheated rooms that will burn you alive if you stick around for too long. So go explore elsewhere, and hopefully you'll find a new power-up. Maybe some missiles, or high jump boots, a grapple beam, an ice beam, or an insulated suit that can withstand heat. Now you can travel back to that obstacle and overcome it. That might reward you with a handy upgrade, or it might reveal the next chunk of the map. So through this repeating loop of explore and unlock, Super Metroid is all about using exploration and your memory of the world map to slowly unpick a giant knot of locks and keys until you find your way to the final boss. It is a wonderfully satisfying formula that has sustained an entire genre of so-called Metroidvania games, from PS1 favourite Symphony of the Night to modern indie gems like Hollow Knight. Super Metroid is available on the Switch online service. For some of the older games on this list, you might have to cast your mind back to the 80s or 90s to truly understand what made them so special. But for Pokemon Blue, it would be very helpful if you could actually time travel back to 1996. Because, sure, Pokemon is a cute little RPG in its own right. It is a game about catching monsters, training them up, teaching them moves, and then doing battle with other Pokemon trainers. And you'll need to think about elemental pair-ups, as grass-type monsters will mop the floor with water types, but get burnt to a cinder by fire-based critters. But what made Pokemon so special was the fact that you could trade monsters from one Game Boy to another using a link cable. To encourage this, Pokemon was split into two games, Red and Blue, which are almost identical except for a number of Pokemon that are exclusive to each game. So if you want Vulpix or Electabuzz, you'll need a link cable. Other Pokemon would only evolve after being traded, and the starter Pokemon never show up again in your game, so you'll need to beg your friend for their Bulbasaur. Pokemon is an excellent example of building community around a game, not just through competition, but through trading and helping each other out. Pokemon Blue version is sadly not easy to play today, but it's also not recommended you walk up to a 10-year-old and ask if they want to see your Geodude. So maybe check out a more recent version and use your imagination for what it would be like to trade these things on the school playground. In my mind, two games really defined the jump to fully 3D gameplay: Super Mario 64 and Tomb Raider. And both were about jumping around tricky three-dimensional obstacle courses. But then again, they worked in very different ways. Mario is all about fluidity, speed, and bouncy trampoline jumps, whereas Tomb Raider is about positioning, patience, and precision. making your way through these ancient ruins is almost like navigating a submarine or setting up an elaborate machine. You must observe the environment and execute moves perfectly to get Lara Croft from A to B. Today, in a world where characters magnetically snap to ledges and automatically clamber up walls, this sort of precise movement can feel antiquated and frustrating. But once you get into it and feel the satisfaction of overcoming a bunch of obstacles, you realise that there's something to be gained by making movement more involved. Tomb Raider can be played on all platforms as part of a remaster that features all 3 PS1 games. You can press a single button to revert the game back to its original style. Resident Evil was certainly not the first survival horror game. In fact, many of its ideas were inspired by Alone in the Dark, including the iconic fixed camera perspective. But hey, one game led to a thriving franchise of critically acclaimed games, and the other led to an Uwe Boll movie, so here we are. There are plenty of ways that Resident Evil made players feel scared and unsettled, from the aforementioned camera angle to the clunky movement to good old-fashioned jump scares. But the one I want to point out is the way Resident Evil simply restricts how much stuff you can have. Key items like ammunition and healing herbs are rare, which means you can't blast your gun at anything that moves. Instead, you need to carefully conserve ammo, consider every shot, and sometimes choose to just run away from enemies. And then there's the inventory, a tiny cramped grid. Instead of carrying about an entire arsenal of different guns, you have to think carefully about what items you need right now. It's a perfect lesson in how a designer can make a player feel empowered or disempowered simply by turning the big dial labelled resources. Resident Evil is hard to play outside of using original hardware in 2024, so feel free to check out the impressive HD remake, which is available on all major platforms. Valve's Half-Life tells a complete story, but without ever stopping for a cutscene. The game follows Gordon Freeman, a nerdy scientist who gets caught up in an alien invasion. He'll have to fight monsters, solve puzzles, fend off the military, and even spend a bit of time on the aliens' home planet of Zen. But the game's narrative innovation is that the whole thing takes place from Gordon's perspective, and in real time, without breaks, level transitions, or cutscenes. This gives the game an immersive and grounded feel, which operates on the strengths of video games rather than simply copying what works in movies. So when characters talk to you, they look directly into the camera.